two teenage boys in Elmira, Ontario, Canada, went on a vandalism spree in which they caused thousands of dollars of damage across 22 different properties. Tires on cars were slashed, windows were broken, and even 2 churches were vandalized. The teenagers were intoxicated. The town was a small, tight-knit community, and the Elmira case, as it eventually came to be known, became notorious among residents of the city because of the broad impacts it had on the community. At the same time, the Mennonite church in the area was wrestling with ways to make their calling to peace more impactful in the world. Mirroring broader trends in North American Mennonite communities, the local Mennonite community was shifting out of a long practice of sectarian withdrawal from the messy affairs of society, if you will. Mennonites in Ontario and elsewhere were seeking ways to be engaged in public life that built peace by doing justice in public life while remaining faithful to their Christian faith that centers peacemaking and renouncing violence. This had been happening in a very practical way in nearby Kitchener since 1968, when the Mennonite church there began to brainstorm the possibility of birthing an alternative to the criminal justice system. The Elmira case was their opportunity. Mark Yancey and Dave Worth were the people leading the Mennonite Church of Canada's Ontario efforts to birth a new way of doing justice, and they were invited to experiment with a different way to do justice in the Elmira case, in part because the 2 teenage boys involved didn't have previous criminal records, and the community in which it happened desired some resolution that would bring the community back together. And so the Mennonite Church of Canada, in collaboration with Ontario Judge G.H. McConnell and the people of Elmira, birthed the Victim Offender Reconciliation Program. Grounded in face-to-face meetings between people who've committed a crime and those who were the victims of said crimes, the Victim Offender Reconciliation Program, or VORP, sought to make possible experiences of reconciliation between people who had been harmed and those who directly caused those harms. Emerging out of Mennonite Christian theologies of God's all-encompassing peace, drawn from their interpretation of the Hebrew Bible concept of shalom and the Christian call to the ministry of reconciliation, VORP became the first formal restorative justice practice utilized by dominant North American criminal justice systems in cases involving non-Indigenous peoples. Inspired by a relational and all-encompassing vision of God's justice in the world, Mennonite theologians and practitioners have become leading advocates for a vision of the work of justice as the work of creating right relationships. Right relationships in this worldview are ones grounded in interconnectedness, the repair and healing of harm, and living together with others, including with one's enemies, in ways that contribute to mutual flourishing. In other words, right relationships require that people be in relationship with others in ways that reflect the character of God. At least this is how those earliest practitioners understood their work. In general, VORPs were composed of face-to-face meetings between people who'd been harmed in some way, that is the victim, those who had harmed them, that is the offender, and a facilitator. The offender or the person who caused harm arrived to the VORP prepared to admit their guilt, provide some description of what they had done and why they'd done it, and to listen to the impacts of their actions on the victims of their actions. The survivors of the harms done arrived ready to share those impacts and to state what possible repairs of the harm might be able to be achieved by the person or persons who harmed them. In collaboration with the facilitator, then, the victim and the offender would come to a mutual agreement about ways forward for repair and maybe reconciliation. In the Elmira case, with its experimental nature, the 2 boys went door to door to have these conversations. And eventually the boys made apologies and paid some fines. And once VORP became formalized, those meetings occurred in more formal settings. Russ Kelly, one of the original teenagers who caused harm, who went on the spree, has said, reflecting on this process, reflecting on the Elmira case, quote, "It took every ounce of courage I had to stand on these people's property and meet them face to face. To see the anger in their eyes and the disgust on their face, I felt very much ashamed," end quote. But imagining how this could have gone differently, he said, quote, "I quite likely would have come out a hardened person, a hardened heart, chip on my shoulder, angry at society and everyone in it. I probably would have ended up in jail again," end quote. But instead, Kelly went to college and became an advocate for youth caught up in the criminal system. Over time, the success of this and other cases led to wider adoption of such practices beyond Kitchener, Ontario. For example, in 1978, the first VORP program was implemented in Elkhart, Indiana, by Mennonites, including Howard Zehr, who became the first widely recognized theorist of restorative justice as an approach and a movement to repair harm and restore right relationships. Located in a partnership between a community-based organization in Elkhart, the Elkhart County Pact, an acronym for Prisoners and Community Together, experienced success and became a model that was looked to alongside the Elmira case as founding examples of what restorative justice, what the repair of right relationships could look like in practice. And at the same time that Elmira and Elkhart were underway, others were radically rethinking criminal justice. Nils Christie, a Norwegian criminologist, published his classic article, Conflict as Property, in 1977. Drawing in part on experiences of community-based conflict transformation and justice practices in East Africa and the failures of the systems in Europe, Christie critiqued dominant Western justice systems for the ways that they disempowered communities by outsourcing the work of transforming their conflicts to the state. In doing so, people became removed from the kind of control over their lives that makes community, in any robust sense of the word, actually possible. And around the same time, Angela Davis, a racial justice and black liberation activist and formerly incarcerated political prisoner, became deeply and vocally critical of prisons and dominant criminal punishment systems after her release from prison in early 1972. And just 5 days after being acquitted of all charges, she issued her first public call for the total abolition of prisons because of their racist and sexist brutality and ineffectiveness. And these weren't the only such voices calling for radical change in how we conceived of how we should respond to crime. Many people around the world were beginning to recognize that the present systems were broken, and that something like VORP could be a viable alternative. And over time, VORP came to be implemented in more and more places and kinds of cases, utilized in both juvenile and adult cases, though mostly youth cases, and most often in cases of property crime. The model has been successful in both in highlighting the relational aspects of crime and spurring creative thinking about how justice should be done in its wake. As it became more entrenched as a viable alternative to traditional criminal proceedings, the Mennonite Christian emphasis on reconciliation came to be less emphasized, and the language of victim-offender mediation, victim-offender dialogues, and eventually victim-offender conferencing, or VOCs, became dominant. As VORPs evolved into various forms of victim-offender dialogues, circle processes were being experimented with in Hollow Water and elsewhere, and eventually both would become central tools in the restorative justice toolkit. VOCs, as they're practiced today, typically follow a basic structure. Some criminal case is referred either to a diversion specialist within a criminal justice system or a community-based partner like in an NGO. The case is screened for its appropriateness, including an examination of the type of criminal charge, the harms that were done, and the willingness of the accused to participate and take responsibility for the harms they've caused. The person harmed is contacted to gauge their willingness to participate in the process, and then the facilitator meets one-on-one with both victim and offender to prepare them for the process, including helping the victim to identify their needs, and both victim and offender to identify support people who might meet with them throughout the process. And then, the actual dialogue or conference in which the person harmed and the person who caused the harm meet face to face, in the presence of the facilitator and potentially a few support people to share their stories, the impacts of the harm, and come to an agreement about ways forward for the harms to be repaired and the relationship healed, if that's desired and possible. Like all restorative justice processes, VOCs are grounded in some key values related to a vision of crime as a violation of relationships and of harms done to those relationships and or the people within them, and a vision of justice as the healing of such harms or relationships. Daniel Van Ness and his co-authors in the most recent edition of their influential textbook Restoring Justice identify these key values as repair, inclusion, cohesion, and encounter. The value of repair refers to the need to assist those who've experienced and survived harms to have their needs met, their stories believed and validated, material losses regained, a sense of safety restored, physical or medical needs attended to, and reputations repaired. The value of inclusion refers to the need to have everyone involved or impacted by harms done to have a voice and a stake in the process and its resolution. The value of cohesion refers to the need for broader community contexts, relationships, families, social structures, etc., to be recognized as having a stake in harms done and harms experienced, and as part of the process of restoring justice in some way. And finally, the value of encounter refers to the need for some face-to-face or embodied experience of human interaction that informs this work of justice as healing. For Van Ness and his co-authors, this last value, that of encounter, is what really separates restorative justice from other forms of reparative justice, like restitution or something like that. In short, it's the value and experience of encounter that enables a relational vision of crime and therefore of justice to become possible. Central to such encounters is a dual focus: discovering what those who've experienced harms need to have those harms healed, and identifying ways those who have caused those harms can practice accountability in ways that meet those expressed needs. In the words of restorative justice practitioner Danielle Serret in her book Until We Reckon, restorative justice encounters are about finding ways for those who've done harm to, quote, do sorry, end quote, in ways that actually meet the needs of those that they've harmed. Repair and accountability, healing and responsibility. These are the dual movements of restorative justice practices like VOCs. And generally speaking, the evidence suggests that such restorative justice programs are more effective than mainstream justice as punishment practices, at both reducing crime and at being victim-oriented. Recidivism rates are lower, self-reported victim satisfaction with the process is higher, and the financial and material costs are lower. This is incredible, especially when we consider how woefully underfunded and understaffed such programs generally are in comparison to the costs of policing, surveillance, court proceedings, and incarceration. However, the overwhelming majority of these restorative justice cases involve the kinds of harms those in the broader society are more likely to be lenient toward, those committed by youth or first-time offenders, instances of property crime, etc. But even in the hard cases, like those of violence, these findings seem to remain consistent. Now, I've told a story of Mennonites birthing what we now call the mainstream restorative justice movement. And the broad strokes of this story and of contemporary practice are accurate and true. However, what I want to invite us into seeing and telling this story is what is consistent with the story of circle processes that we learned in the first lecture. That beginning in the last few decades of the 20th century, there were an interconnected series of experiments in doing justice in new ways that emphasized the relational aspects of crimes, the need to repair harms experienced by real people and communities, and not just violations of the abstract laws of the state, and the work of healing both individuals and relationships that have been harmed. And this series of loosely connected experiments is what we now call and recognize as the global restorative justice movement. Practitioners and activists of all stripes came to recognize that dominant systems of criminal punishment were full of injustice, violence, and a failure to succeed at the work of meeting the needs of those who've experienced harm by others. Indigenous communities responded with circle processes, Mennonite Christians with VORP, and criminal justice systems participated by working with these communities to seed experiments and pilot programs. Over time, these formal criminal legal systems have become the primary spaces in which many people see restorative justice practice. And for some, restorative justice has come to mean something like alternatives to punishment or diversion programs or something like that. However, at its root, restorative justice is a way of seeing the world and understanding justice that is tied to repair, healing, and relationality. For Hollowater, this way of seeing was grounded in an indigenous conception of relationality and interdependence. For Yazzie, it's grounded in a Navajo vision of peacemaking and being a good relation to others. For Mennonite Christians, this way of seeing the world was grounded in a biblical theology of shalom and reconciliation. And the practices that emerged out of these ways of seeing the world and understanding justice are unique and particular to the times, places, and contexts in which they emerged. However, it's not these practices, but this reorientation of what one understands justice to be that is at the heart of what restorative justice is and can become. That is an experience of healing.